Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book. The discussion may take us in new directions. Henry Olson is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a columnist for the Washington Post.
Okay, welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead, a professor at NYU. We appreciate your interest in poverty and culture, a very important question. Roughly, culture means what we think life's about, what we seek to do and be. And the thing we're going to be talking about here is cultural difference. A theme of my own book, Burdens of Freedom, is that America is divided culturally. We have a dominant culture that came from Europe with most elements of our population, but there are also other groups, minority groups typically, who came from the non-West and who therefore reflect a very different culture. What are the chief differences? Well, in the Western world, cultures are individualist. Typically, people think of themselves as pursuing personal goals and adjusting to the necessity that may require when they do that. On the other hand, the non-West is more cautious. They typically are adjusting to outside pressures rather than seeking change on their own behalf. Another major difference is that for the West, moral attitudes tend to be internalized, abstract, and general. Westerners typically think that right and wrong, as they understand it, apply to all circumstances. Whereas in the non-West, the moral structure is much more dependent on context and on the situation, and people understand right and wrong in terms of what other people expect of them. So it doesn't have the same abstract character found in the West. Now, two other things to know. First of all, neither culture is superior in general. There's no idea here that West or non-Western culture is superior. Rather, they're different. They have different strengths and weaknesses. And another key point is that neither culture is connected in any necessary way to race. There's nothing that says that a white person has to be an individualist and a non-white person someone with non-Western attitudes. That doesn't follow. It depends very much on how people are socialized. So that's what I'm going to say now, and let me ask for Henry's reactions.
Yeah, Larry, I think that is a overbroad generalization that I don't think is supported by data with respect to its impact on poverty or even with respect to its impact on social development, that either in the United States or in the experience of other countries. That I'd be happy to hear how you have tried to describe things as the rapid rise of Japan from backwards feudalistic power in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry forcibly opened the country to the West to the country that shocked the Western world by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War less than 60 years later. But there's a host of questions that I've gotten why I don't subscribe to that thesis. But let's start with there, which is how do you explain the rapid industrialization of places like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and the others if Western culture is one of the advantages implicitly, since you've tied it to poverty, that Western culture, one of their advantages is the acquisition of material wealth and the ability to create a functioning capitalist system?
The short answer is I deal with Asia extensively in the book, as a matter of fact, and I never suggest that their recent progress is due to having or not having an individualist culture. On the contrary, they've done it on a very different basis from the West. Japan is certainly an exceptional success story. China is currently becoming a great power. Both of them are highly collective societies with very, very different psychology than the West. Japan, in addition, is a well-governed society, which is unusual for Asia. China is very badly governed. Nevertheless, they found a way to get rich and powerful, very different from the West. And that, to me, supports the importance of culture. Much of the book deals with domestic social issues, their cultural difference is also important. But I want to emphasize that I do not deny in any way the Asian success. Quite the contrary. It seems to me that Asia has strengths and weaknesses compared to the West. It's very good at collective effort when the leadership gives a clear direction. The Asian countries can pull together and achieve something, and certainly Japan did that. However, because the culture is collective and people really don't think for themselves except at a leadership level, um, Asia has a problem with innovation. And also, Asia, and this is characteristic of the non-West, is not able really to combine order and freedom in the way that the West does. The different psychology of the West allows it to combine commitment to civic values and strong government with a capacity for innovation. And historically, that is the way in which the West became dominant worldwide. It had enormous dynamism that came from the problem solving capacities of a broad population that was individualist. At the same time, these populations also internalized a civic culture that allowed them to be well governed. And it's that combination that isn't really normal. In fact, we don't find that except in a couple of very small cases. Asia, in fact, Japan is probably the leading case of a society that has become well governed as well as productive and rich. That isn't really normal. The other cases you mentioned, like South Korea, Taiwan, are similar to Japan, except that they developed those capacities under strong American leadership and indeed pressure after World War II. So they're not as impressive a story as Japan. But the rest of Asia is not terribly well governed and has many problems that result really from the non-Western culture. So I think the Asian story is in fact quite consistent with what I say.
Well, again, I'm going to doubt that, when you take a look at the actual history of things like Japanese industrialization, particularly post-war, there's a number of examples of individuals who bucked the demands of the government that tried to say we don't need another car manufacturer. I forget whether it was Honda or Toyota was the example of the individual who refused to go along with the commands of Mead, the government bureaucracy, and built their car company into an international powerhouse. So I think you speak with way too broad of a brush when you say they don't think for themselves, that they are a collective. I mean, there are certainly strong differences, and it would be ignorant to deny that there are strong differences. But to paint with the brush that you've got, I think, or paint in the way that you have, I think is inaccurate.
Well, it depends on how closely you look at a society. If you look at very close-up cases of the kind you mentioned, you will certainly find people who innovated, who broke from the crowd, so on and so on. I don't deny that, but that isn't what the research says. I mean, my book is based upon research on world cultural differences by a broad range of scholars, about a dozen of them, and they all say what I'm summarizing here. They basically don't agree with what you're saying. Yes, you can find cases where individuals broke from the crowd, but in fact, that isn't more typical of Asia. That really isn't typical. The leadership is typical. The leadership is the case where you see often very great leadership, and that you saw that in Japan. You see it recently in China. But the society as a whole is not involved in problem solving. The problem solving is at the top. Other people are obeying orders, and the society really can't tolerate large scale innovation and maintain its coherence. See, that for that you need to have the very unusual psychology of the Western world, which combines compliance with legitimate authority, with a willingness to challenge authority, and also innovate in ways that they do without asking for anybody's permission. They just go and do it. And it's that temperament, which we don't find in Asia. So I think these generalities are worthwhile. Now, if you look at particular cases, but I also see it in my students. I mean, Asian students in the United States have significant problems developing their own ideas and deciding what to do for themselves. They're simply not as comfortable with that as people from a European background. So these are real differences, and they operate on an average basis. You can obviously find exceptions, but that is in general the story. And I think it says a lot about our social problems and also about development. I mean, I've read a number of other books recently that emphasize the importance of culture in international development. And the countries that are poor are typically countries in which the the structure of the country is in the grip of a non-Western society that is very, very deferential to authority. And they don't have the capacity to tolerate large-scale innovation and certainly a market economy. That is something very threatening to them. And it's hard for outsiders to come in and help them because the leadership is committed to a certain power structure. And the great fact about the West is that we accepted long ago that we were going to tolerate the innovation, constant innovation of people at the bottom of the society without government getting in the way. Government, in fact, maintains the rules and the structure, but we allow competition, innovation, and so on and so on, and we somehow reconcile that with order. That is the combination that may allow the West to dominate the world. I mean, I think that's pretty clear from the history.
I'd like to ask you then, turning to the West, when you look at the history of Western Europe in the 19th century, it certainly does not demonstrate that sort of question of order and innovation, that much innovation.
What I see in the leading Western countries, not all of them, but most of them, you see exactly the quality that I'm describing. The United States shows to a greater extent the qualities that Europe has shown throughout its history. England is the leading case, and the Netherlands. These are the countries that are out front. But the rest of Europe came along a little later, very much in the same way. And Europe as a whole ended up dominating the world. So I don't accept the view that the English-speaking countries have something special about them. They have unusual political gifts in that they got their institutions together very early. That's true. But they're fundamentally similar to the other Western countries, Germany, France, Spain. Some get it together later, and there's been a significant improvement in the constitutional structure of those countries after World War II. But all of them are essentially part of a Western culture that has the features I've described. And that is why they ended up building empires and expressing power and dominance of the world, not always for good. The Western culture is a culture of mastery. It's not a culture of tolerance. It has many weaknesses, which the non-West is better at. But in terms of wealth and power, no question, this culture has been the most dominant. Now, the Asians are doing very well right now, but again, there are limitations on what they can do because of their inability to innovate at the same level. So I don't think we can change our fundamental view about this. Culture.
And I would disagree. One is that it's rather obvious, that the West acquired the ability to project its will throughout throughout the world. That was a function of modern science. That modern science was developed by individuals and adopted and permitted to adopt by countries in the West, and that doesn't necessarily mean industrialization, although industrialization certainly dramatically improved that ability. But you can start to see a dominance of Western powers on the battlefield in the 16th and particularly in the 17th century as it uses the fruits of modern science to defeat non-Western cultures. But of course, at that time, one would never say that most of those places were terribly well governed. That you have, with the exception of England, you have weak governance in France. You have divided government in the 39 to hundreds of states of Germany. You have Italy divided. Spain conquers an empire because of their technological superiority. They then sink into European irrelevance. So again, I think you're confusing the accident or perhaps the separate cultural strand that gave rise to the creation of modern science in the West with the broader cultural traits that you're describing.
That isn't true. Science plays a role in industrialization and economic wealth really only from the later 19th century. Before that, industrialization was the doing of brilliant mechanics who had frequently no education. They're the ones who figured out the steam engine and the other elements that went into the English Industrial Revolution. And the same in America. We have creative people with virtually no background who put it together. And what's striking is their willingness to take the risks involved in that and the fact that it was tolerated by the regime. That's what's surprising. It's at the end of the 19th century, and especially in German industrialization, you begin to see the importance of science increases, no question about that. the importance of electricity, chemistry, these things the Germans led. And the British fell behind, and they weren't as dominant from that point on economically. But the Europe as a whole was a hive of innovation. And the other countries you mentioned, although they were weak, they weren't as well governed as Britain, that's true. But France, Spain, the Netherlands, the Low Countries, parts of Eastern Europe, not when you go further east, you don't get as good government as you have further west. Nonetheless, Europe as a whole is well governed compared to the rest of the world. And that is a major reason why the wealth was used constructively to produce power. And you can question, of course, whether imperialism is a good thing, but the capacity to project power that the Europeans had was exceptional. And that was because they had strong government as well as wealth, and they put it all together. And I don't think you can really deny that. And it's Europe as a whole that does this, not just one or two countries.
I think we're defining science somewhat differently. When I'm thinking of science, I'm thinking about the devotion of the human mind to, as I believe it was Francis Bacon, or perhaps it was John Locke, talked about alleviating man's estate, and that means that as early as the 16th century, you have innovation with respect to, particularly with respect to military technologies, that it's the West that people in the West adopting this who create seaworthy boats and elements of navigation that allows them to cross the Atlantic consistently as opposed to accidentally or happenstance as the Vikings did in the early 11th century. You have them using and adopting, the reason the Spanish conquer Latin America is they're the only ones with guns.
So
that's not science in the way you defined it, but it's science that's.
I call it problem solving. Problem solving. I'll give you problem solving, but exactly the application of problem solving to new problems exactly what set the West apart. Whereas in the rest of the world, that was not really supported because it was a threat to the regime. I mean, the Chinese were out in front for a while. They were actually beginning to investigate the world, and they pulled back in the 17th century. They pulled back. They couldn't tolerate science. They couldn't tolerate new ideas. And Japan and Japan is a little bit different. Japan became more tolerant of political contention. There are a lot of things special about Japan, but the rest of Asia, no, you don't find anything like this. And that is what you have to reckon with. There's a mindset here that allows the West to get ahead in all these areas. And I don't emphasize that it's superior, because there's certain things the West is not good at. But in terms of wealth and power, I don't really see any issue. And attempts by various scholars to show that the non-West was somehow had a similar story are quite unpersuasive. We really have to reckon with mindset is really important here. And we also shouldn't say, as we tend to say, that the Western view of things is somehow universal. I mean, the tendency in America today is to assume that we have a universal culture that is somehow the same for everyone around the world. And of course, the whole world wants to immigrate to America, so it looks like that. It can look like that. But in fact, that isn't true. The individualist culture is a small part of humanity. Most of humanity is living a life much more like the non-West, which is engaged in survival, which is adjusting to outside forces. It does not seek the mastery of those forces. And that what is unusual about the West is that it did seek control, it did seek mastery, and that extends to individual people. See, the other thing that I find remarkable about the Western story is that it's coming from the bottom. All levels of the society are part of the innovation that leads to Western wealth and power. It isn't led by the elites. Whereas in the rest of the world, to the extent there's any innovation, it's always led by the elites. You really don't find a broad-based interest in solving problems and getting ahead and so on, because the burdens of freedom are heavy. To take on those burdens is something that most of the world doesn't want to do. And to take that as some kind of universal is wrong. I think a lot of American problems in the world result from the fact we just assume that everybody's like us. And that just isn't true.
Well, again, I think you're painting with way too broad of a brush, and I think some of that can be seen in how well immigrants from non-Western backgrounds do in the countries in which they plant themselves. That you have, take a look at this Asian success story here. There's very little Asian poverty, entrenched poverty. You take a look at
much, but this is one of the main things. In fact, that's probably the only frequent criticism of my argument. People think that Asians somehow are outside the scheme that I'm proposing. Actually not. Asians avoid the worst social problems that you find among blacks and Hispanics, also Native Americans. They do avoid that, and they do very well in school, but they don't do very well after school, because that requires that you show leadership. You have to get out front. You have to make personal arguments and take risks. And that isn't something that most Asians want to do. And I found that on my own teaching experience, and other professors say the same. Asians expect to be told what the question is, where most of leadership is deciding what the question is, as a matter of fact. See, in a sense, you do that in your column. See, when you write, you start with essentially a blank piece of paper, and you put together an argument that reflects your point of view. And so there's a creative process that goes on in your head that allows you to come out with an interpretation of what's going on. That is not something that most of the world is comfortable doing. And I find this in my classes. I mean, my papers basically expect students to do that. And the ones that can do it are typically people from European backgrounds. And the Asians have a much harder time. It isn't lack of intelligence. It's an inability to imagine a new world based on your own understanding. That is not something that they want to do. And that's a problem in Asia today, so far as showing innovation.
One thing that I found interesting in one of Charles Murray's books is that he compiled a list from all sources of the 900 to 1,000 most influential inventors in medicine, science, mathematics, and so on. And he did not choose these members by himself, but based on references, numbers of references, and so on. There's about 1,000 in there, and I counted 6 Japanese. This is from the period 800 to World War II, and 10 Chinese. So this is very, I think, very. There's a difference between excellence in execution and innovative thinking. One anecdote that I recount is from China, where I was in a hotel with men that had come over to fix the expensive air conditioning system. They said you couldn't really get inventors to come from mainland China unless they'd been educated in Hong Kong, Taiwan, or an American university. So I think there's a lot of limitations that come from that culture.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute. It's rather obvious that the application of man's mind to the relief of man's estate, which is the fundamental underpinning of the industrialization, the modern science that we now see through has spread across the world, originated in Western countries. I don't think anyone disputes that. I mean, Chinese may have invented gunpowder, but the systematic application of the human intellect to the physical world is something that arose in Western countries. And I think that's what Charles Murray's list would get at, which is to say that if one limits oneself to 1945, one's going and says, well, let's take a look at the application of the human mind to the physical world, you're going to get a list of people who are primarily from the West, because that's where it originated, and that's where the knowledge could build upon itself. So that you had somebody building on, nobody in China in 1800 had probably contact between the West and other countries remained relatively limited until the 19th century.
But Henry, that's a civilization that's older than ours, and they had a lot of experience over the centuries. Why didn't China develop the same kind of scientific and other innovations that the West did?
I think that's a great historical question, but that's not the question that Larry's posing. The question that Larry's posing is saying that these are enduring things that apply not only in the past, but apply in the current world, apply within the United States today with people who are descended and may even have been descended across many generations from a non-Western culture. And that's where I say it's just too broad of a brush that when you have when you have consistently Asian American ethnic groups that are among the highest, if not the highest income, median income generators in the United States, you can't say that they're not succeeding.
No,
And if what you want to do is you want to say, well, let's take a look at who's at the very top of the corporations world. You can make lots of comments about subgroups of Western ethnic or white ethnic types as well. Is that you can probably note there haven't been a whole lot of the various types of immigrants at the tops of these various corporations, even if they're doing quite well being innovative or being business people in other realms, like mid-range companies or in construction businesses or so forth. So I just think that this is it's not that culture is irrelevant. I'm never arguing that, but the argument that you're making is much too broad of a brush, and I think doesn't account for what we observe.
The discussion we have about social problems is couched in terms of group differences. And as I see it, you're defending what I call sameness, the idea that there is no elemental overall difference between groups, but rather that we should treat everyone the same and just look at individual differences. Now, if you do that, then you can cause the group identities to disappear, become unimportant. That's true. But I think you're losing the woods for the trees. You're making a trees argument, and I'm making a woods argument. And the reason I got into this is because in the problems that I focused on, which is the three that I mentioned in the preface, poverty, serious poverty, particularly serious poverty, immigration, and third world development, in all those areas, you've seen an exhaustion of research where scholars initially thought that the backwardness of these groups or these countries was due to various impediments that they could specify. And they went looking for social barriers. And it's now about 40 years later than I first learned about this. And what we're seeing is the end of all of those research traditions because they have nothing to say. I mean, I've served several times recently on national commissions and groups about poverty, inequality, the working class, et cetera, et cetera. And in all these cases, there were experts from every persuasion. And I don't recall any of them fundamentally claiming that we can understand the differences between the groups here. They disagreed about policy, but really not about explanation because the explanations have been exhausted. The search for barriers has failed. And because of that, we have to take culture more seriously than we have. And obviously, every culture is a generalization. But this is what we haven't been willing to do. And I think the reason ultimately is a fear of racism. We feel that because of civil rights 50 years ago, we have to now look at people only as individuals and ignore group identity. That's what I think causes us really not to think in these terms. But then we can't solve our problems. We have to recognize that there are problems. And these groups, all the groups we're talking about, struggle with the fact that they're uncomfortable with individualism. That is their fundamental problem. And that's true for the Asians too. They are more successful because they avoid social problems on the same level as blacks and Hispanics, but they are not, in fact, comfortable in America until they become more individualist, until they're willing to assert themselves and someone like, for example, Andrew Yang is running for mayor of New York. Now, there is an Asian who has fully taken on the burdens of freedom. He is an individualist. He may or may not win the election, but he is uninhibited by the fact that he's coming from an Asian background. Most Asians are not like that. They really have a problem breaking free of their family and their background. And that is something that we simply have to notice. Now, it's not the main social problem. That goes with the other groups that are worse off, blacks and Hispanics especially. And in those cases, you find significant difficulty in mobilizing one's personal lives to pursue a goal. What you find instead is short-term survival. People are simply getting through the day. and they're not able to organize their lives around a goal. Whereas most of us, all three of us, and Michelle as well, are people who are pursuing goals. And to that end, we confine what we do to things that are supportive for our goals. And we worked out careers for ourselves, which we could not have done without that. I mean, I know a little bit about your career, Henry, and I'm very impressed at the way you've made yourself into a leading commentator on the newspaper. And as far as I can say, you put that together yourself. You simply went after it and you did what you had to do it. And that's what I've done. And that's what Jay's done. And Michelle, we've all done that. See, and it's that style of life that we don't see amongst minorities. And because they don't simply think in terms of those terms. They're thinking in terms of reacting to outside pressures and demands rather than focusing on their own internal desires. See, the really heavy burdens of freedom are the goals that you set for yourself. And that is, in fact, how most people live in a society that's individualist. They have goals that they pursue. They may not be as ambitious as the kind of goals that we've pursued personally, but they still have a goal. And it's that makes the society dynamic. And that's what we don't find amongst the less privileged groups. They are not, in fact, thinking of life in those terms. And another important part of the argument, though, is that I emphasize that part of Black America has, in fact, internalized an individualist ethic. And we do have a Black middle class. And they behave just like all of us would behave. They also are individualists. And that is why they're so effective, because they've taken on the burdens of freedom. But the bulk of the group is not. And that is our basic problem. We have to somehow promote assimilation of an individual's ethos amongst Blacks as a whole and Hispanics as a whole. That's what they have to do to be comfortable in America. Now, what do you think of that? Is that meaningful to you, or is that just too broad brush?
I think it is way too broad brush, Larry.
So what would you do instead?
I think that there are people who, cross racial and cross cultural backgrounds, think that life is set against them. And there are people who feel in varying degrees out of control of their lives. And these are people who will find it difficult. They, where some people will see opportunity, they will see non-opportunity. I think that you see plenty of people across culture and racial backgrounds who do see opportunity and see control of their lives. You see it in people, the simple fact of immigration to the United States or elsewhere suggests non-passivity, because you have to take a very risky action in order to effect a change. And you see, I know plenty of people who are immigrants to this country who had goals set about making. They may not, because of their background, be academic goals. They're the person who sets about becoming a maid and supporting their family, or they're the person who sets about creating a small landscaping business, like the Uruguayan who put together a business when I lived in New York. But they, unless you're defining West, very differently than I think you're defining West, since you've included the Hispanic world, the broad Hispanic world, not Spain and Portugal, but Latin, what we call in America, Latin America, call the United States Latin America. That's just not what I see. That
you don't see any generalities. You don't see any common themes here. It's all individuals that you know about.
Larry, I think there has been a problem of governance in a lot of countries in the world. There was a problem of governance in most of Europe until the American domination, accomplished by force of arms. Germany was not a free and stable country until we crushed it. No. Italy was not a free and stable country until we conquered it.
In the later 19th century, it became the most formidable country in Europe.
It was a highly centralized state with the government controlled by the emperor and the chancellor, where the Bundestag was gerrymandered.
Government as well. It was not a democracy in our sense. I totally agree with that. It was a great power. And the rest of Europe was afraid of it, with reason.
It was
World War II.
It was a centralized military power.
Yes, it was very impressive.
And how is that different from Japan of the same era? They both had powerless parliaments. They both had strong leaders and a centralized leadership. They both developed industries in order to project their power. They both sought conquest in near areas and colonies in far areas, and they provoked wars with their neighbors in order to proceed and pursue their expansionist aims. How is Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan qualitatively different?
They're different culturally. Japan is a collective society, which has the attributes of a collective society. Germany is an individualist society, which is a Western country. And it is today still the strongest power in Europe. And it didn't depend on the United States. The United States was crucial for democratizing the regime after World War II. That's true. But the regime was already strong. And the reason why Japan and Germany recovered quickly from the war was because they were already highly developed before the war. Now, Japan made major errors. I mean, they should never have embarked on an empire. They should never have attacked Pearl Harbor. I mean, they did a number of stupid things. And there's no question about it. Germany did stupid things with Hitler, obviously. But the fact is they were greatly developed countries beforehand. But Japan is not typical of Asia. Japan is exceptional. And the German story is unusual only in that the country was unified so late due to a number of accidents in their earlier history. But as a culture, Germany is absolutely part of Europe, and they became a great power. And the other European powers, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, they all got it together sooner, and to varying degrees, they also became powers. So the European story is more important than the story of a given country. And we shouldn't deny that. Europe as a whole is different from the rest of the world. And these countries today, all of which are small by world standards, are still the richest countries today because they have that ability to combine order and freedom, which the West is uniquely able to do. And
it's that freedom part that I'm arguing about, Larry, is that freedom didn't exist in Europe for most of its period. France struggles with establishing freedom until the Third Republic, and even then it struggles with maintaining that democratic freedom. The anti-democratic element is extremely strong.
Not as well governed as England. The government in France was strong in certain senses. It was illiberal compared to France and the Netherlands, no question about that. Nonetheless, it was fundamentally a Western country. And it went over to free speech and so on rather quickly in the 19th century after Napoleon. So France is really not a long-term authoritarian country. Germany, you've got a stronger case. But there, too, they converted rather quickly to a Western-style free society because they had the earlier development. And the culture was the key. So
let me ask, what do you consider when I look at France in the 19th century, I look at a country that struggles with the loss of its king. It reestablishes the Bourbon monarchy. It has it has the citizen kingdom of, the citizen king Louis Philippe. And establishes Napoleon III. It establishes the Third Republic only in 1871 after a humiliating defeat by the Prussians, and remains unstable with respect to a strong anti-democratic formula. And so the question is, what is freedom? Because when I look at Europe in 1871, there are parliamentary democracies with a limited franchise in Belgium and the Netherlands. There are the beginnings of constitutional monarchy in Denmark and Sweden, but it is still not, parliamentary government is still not fully established there. The French have overthrown their third emperor post-Napoleon and have barely reestablished a democratic government. The Italians are barely organized. The Germans are ruled by an empire. Spain has been in centuries of decrepitude, ruled by a king.
But you
Where's the freedom, Larry?
The freedom is in the fact that all these countries had the rule of law. They were not arbitrarily ruled. They were altogether more developed politically and otherwise than anywhere in the non-Western world. It's true they had limitations compared to the most developed countries, the British and the Dutch. Obviously, that's true. But to compare them with, let us say, the typical South American country or the typical Middle Eastern country, is ludicrous. Those countries were vastly further back, and they remain further back today because their culture doesn't tolerate the combination of freedom and order that the West achieved. France, there's really only one constitutional problem in France, and that is the ability to reconcile centralized authority with a legislative system. They didn't succeed in doing that until the Fifth Republic, very late. And obviously that was a chronic problem. Whereas, and this is the genius that the British had, the British managed to fuse executive authority and parliamentary consent as early as the formation of the kingdom in the 9th century. They somehow get that together in a way that exceeds every other country in Europe. But France is otherwise highly developed. They had a legal system, they had a substantial economy, they had a strong and powerful government and a big military. And of course, under Napoleon, they became a great power and they dominated most of Europe. I mean, you can't say that the French are backward. They have this ongoing political problem about consent, which they didn't solve until the 20th century after World War II. That's true. And that's important. But compared to them, to the non-Western world, there's simply no comparison.
So here's a question. If you take a look at the demographic basis of Argentina and Chile, there's very little indigenous population. It's unlike the rest of Latin America. It's almost all European colonists who have come in. And yet they don't exhibit the same sorts of... so the question is, here's Western peoples, by your definition, Western peoples, who have largely been able to create societies of their own choosing, who don't develop along the lines of the West. Where's your cultural explanation for that?
In the Argentine case, the dominant immigrant groups are Italians and Germans. And it's true that Argentina didn't develop as strong a regime till today as other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Certainly the United States, Canada, and so on are altogether more advanced than Argentina. But Argentina, nonetheless, is still one of the strongest regimes in Latin America. The reason it didn't do better, I think, is because it was still governed by Spain during its formative period, and therefore they didn't really attempt to set up a regime that wasn't Spanish, didn't have the other problems of the Spanish colonies. And the Spanish colonies in Latin America are they're really not at all equivalent to the northern colonies because there was, in fact, very little immigration. Mostly you have Spanish elites presiding over a Native American population, which was third world. And therefore they really are not, they don't have the temperament that is assumed by a democratic system.
Right, that's why I focused on Chile and Argentina, which is that this is a place where these are places where
those countries are nonetheless probably the best governed country, except maybe for Costa Rica. They're the strongest governed countries in Latin America.
Costa Rica and Uruguay have very strong democratic traditions going back.
They're not on a Western level, but they're also well above the typical non-Western countries. So that's a case. Those cases, actually, you have a stronger case in the sense that here you do have a European population, and you might have expected them to do better than they did. I think that you've got a case there. Maybe that's, I don't have a total explanation of why they're not more successful than they are, but nonetheless, they're a lot better off than the Central American countries or other parts of Latin America, including Brazil, where you essentially have a totally non-Western population. These are not people who think in terms of constructing a civic order. That isn't part of their makeup. And that is what we don't really reckon with. I mean, ever since I was at graduate school, the assumption was that once countries got free of the European empires, they were going to assimilate to Western notions of wealth and civility and so on and so on. It simply didn't happen. We didn't pay any attention to cultural difference back then, and we should have. In fact, I mean, that's, I think, one of the main limits. And the reason we didn't is because we have these strong inhibitions against talking about cultural difference because we think it's about race. And we don't want to talk about race. So we have to treat every group as if they're exactly the same psychologically as every other group. But that's exactly where the important differences lie. I don't mean there aren't other differences. Yes, of course. But in general, you don't see the steady progress in the non-Western world that you see in the West. And the reason is that they just don't have a makeup to do that. the culture is oriented to stability and deference to authority, and things therefore don't change. You don't have an inborn tendency towards change and improvement. Is what you find in the West. That's what you don't find in these countries.
And that's what I'm saying is that I'm not saying culture doesn't matter. I think you are painting culture at too broad of a brush, making too broad generalizations rather than looking at the more discrete subcultures or discrete actual culture.
Right.
Which is why I'm bringing up things like individual countries in Europe or these European populations in Latin America, or they don't fit. They don't fit the painting. It's not that culture is irrelevant or unimportant. It's not that there aren't some tendencies that we can find within particular geographic areas. But what the argument you're making is drawing way too much from the evidence and doesn't take.
Well, what does that apply? See, what that leads to, if we say that, it leads to the reign of sameness. We basically deal with very particular features of a country, and we don't reckon with its longstanding problems. We really don't. And that's what government has done in dealing with developing countries ever since the 60s. And we haven't gotten anywhere.
Let me ask you a concrete question, Larry. How would you deal with Mexico? If you were a Mexican, according to your thesis, I'm not talking about my thesis or my argument, your argument, you're in charge of Mexico, you're AMLO. How do you govern? What do you do with Mexico?
I think what I would do, I would start off with an assumption that this is basically a non-Western country with weak commitment to civic values. The institutions are fundamentally stronger than in some other Latin countries, but much, much weaker than in the English-speaking countries because they don't have the same history of institutions going way back. What I would focus on, I would think, primarily be on the legal structure. I would say, and indeed they've tried to do this, I would say the important thing is to remove corruption from the legal system, to have judges who are honest, to prosecutors who are honest, so that people can be held to account for breaking the law. And that ought to be the first priority.
So that would be your way to westernize a non-Western culture in
this case. Yeah, in this case, I would. I don't think there's a solution to Latin America that doesn't involve bringing in a more civic culture. And that requires that we have a more moralistic population where particularly the middle class, the upper class, has to believe in civic values. And in my book, I quote the president of Mexico saying this essentially. Unless we have a more moralistic attitude about obeying the law and resisting corruption, we're not going to get anywhere. And he's right about that. And that is, I think, perhaps the really big difference between many poor countries or poorer countries and the West is corruption. We have some corruption, but it's not systemic. We don't require that ordinary Americans pay off functionaries to do their business. In Mexico, you have to do that. And that is the thing that I would focus on. And they try to focus on it, but unfortunately, the drug gangs are more powerful than the government, and they haven't been able to carry it off.
So why was Costa Rica been able to have a successful democracy that's governed without? Why has Costa Rica had 73 years of consecutive democracy and Mexico struggle?
I think Costa Rica is a little like Japan, a little like England. It's a country which, for mysterious reasons, have unusual political gifts. And especially, I think what you need to think of, what Costa Rica represents actually is what Rousseau wrote about. It's a mostly non-corrupt, unified country of poor farmers who banded together to resist pressure from the outside world. And they formed a more civic regime than the rest of the world was able to do. It's actually similar to the story of Switzerland, if you want to know. Switzerland is another non-English-speaking country that is extremely civic because long ago, the provinces banded together to resist illiberal tendencies they saw coming from Italy and France. And they said, we're not like that. We're going to form our own nation. And they did. It's a peculiar country in lots of ways, but it's extremely civic. I greatly admire Switzerland. Well, Costa Rica is like that. Costa Rica is the exception that proves the rule. Really, that's what it really is. But you can't make a theory out of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the result of fortunate circumstances and also isolation from surrounding countries that allow them to get it together like this. And then there are cases like Singapore, where you have a single strong leader, Lee Kuan Yew, who essentially remade the country from the top down and made it a much more honest and more better governed than it was before. So you can look at countries like this, but they are in fact exceptions that prove the rule. They don't mean the rule is wrong. They don't mean that every country could have been like Costa Rica. I don't see any chance of that, because in the other parts of Central America, you had essentially Spanish-speaking elites who came in and took the territory and exploited it, and never really came to terms with the rest of the populations. That didn't happen in Costa Rica. So, and in Costa Rica,
if the rest of the world had
you don't have that kind of traditional ruling class. You have a more modest middle class, and that is now the basis of the country. So, by the way, they have done rather worse recently, but their case isn't instructive. I don't need to deny the Costa Ricas and the Japans and so on. They're exceptional, but they show that the general story is very different.
But you see, again, the strength of your general story goes back to the early adoption of what I call science, and what I'm more accurately describing as the application of the human mind to this problem solving of the material world. That, yes, that happens first in certain areas of Europe. It happens most systematically there, and that allows, the imperial powers, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, to influence and dominate much of the rest of the world. Of course, we know Germany and Italy are latecomers to that because of their geographic positions and their later unifications. But the reason I keep bringing up these cultural differences, how does your theory explain the European country and is because your theory stated broadly doesn't permit for those differences.
Actually, the main difference is you're reasoning closer to the ground than I am. You're reasoning 5,000 feet off the ground, and I'm reasoning at 20,000 feet off the ground. You're looking at the trees, and I'm looking at the forest. Okay, and from your point of view, it's correct to say that I'm overgeneralizing. But if you don't generalize at the level I'm talking about, then you can't capture the major illusions that have troubled American policy in all these areas for the last several decades, because we have systematically avoided talking about these differences, the big differences. And the small differences aren't enough to explain the problems. You absolutely have to reason at a more general level to understand what's generally the problem in Latin America, generally the problem in the Middle East, generally the problem in Asia. Obviously, there are differences between those regions, but what you can't assume in any case is what we've typically assumed is that these people are just like us. All they need is more opportunity, and all we have to do is give them the kind.
But you certainly can't see evidence of the individualism that Larry is referring to, seizing opportunity and overturning injustice in South America or Asia or Africa. People are trying to fit in and survive in those countries, India included. And as it relates to China, they're accepting of the authority, and that's their way of fitting in. But there's no groundswell in any part of the non-Western world to overturn the systems that they've inherited.
I think that's a good statement of. Now, I would be a little more complicated in that all non-Western countries today have an elite that has been influenced by and educated in the West. There are people who think that they can have democracy and freedom in their country as we have it in the West, and they put pressure on the regime in that direction. But they don't have, as we have, a whole population which has internalized the burdens of freedom. They don't have the massive groundswell of support that we have for good government. For example, consider what happened in the last election, which I think was exceptional. Trump questioned the result. The fact is, no official anywhere in the country involved in elections was willing to change the result to satisfy Donald Trump. The officials of both parties who were involved in the election were completely proper. They did what they were supposed to do. And that shows the depth of the rule of law in this country. And there was simply no possibility that that was going to happen. I also believe that the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was a flash in the pan. It's not at all equivalent to the demonstrations that you read about in third world countries where they're attacking the government. In those countries, there is no basis for a strong regime because the population doesn't have the required attitudes. In America, however, we do have those attitudes, and so we have good government. Not always. There are screw-ups. There are obviously January 6th was a major failure of security and intelligence. We do things wrong, but we pull ourselves together and we go on. And we are not fundamentally misgoverned. And that is what you don't find in the non-West. There's a deep systemic problem that goes back to culture. And although every country is different, and there are some success stories, as you say, the general story is one in which the attitudes don't support strong government. And I don't see any way to get to strong government except for the public to become more moralistic. And there are actually a couple of cases where that's happening. And the one I would mention is India. India, you've had a couple of popular movements have occurred against corruption, in which you've had up from the bottom movements to attack the regime over corruption. And they haven't gotten very far, but that's exactly what they need. That is the real solution long term, is for the public to become impatient with corruption, to treat it as a moralistic issue, and to go after perpetrators. That's what's going to happen, I hope, in India and other countries. So culture can change. That's another thing that's important here. I'm not saying any of this is cast concrete, that you can, in fact, see change. And the best way to promote it is for the United States to, I'm not sure how to promote it, actually. I mean, that's your question about Mexico is a good one. What would I do? I'm not sure what to do. I think it's a fair criticism that in the book I'm rather agnostic about that. I don't think that there's an easy answer because it is rooted in culture, but we obviously have to have a strategy here. And I think that's a fair comment that I need to say more about that. Okay, we're out of time. We just want to make sure you get in the last word, if you like, Henry.
Oh, are we at the end of the hour?
Yeah, we want to limit this to an hour. We've pretty well reached that.
I just want to say I think that culture matters, but I think that your argument is way too overbroad, both with respect to the examples internationally and with respect to the behavior of people within the United States to have a reductio of they came from X, therefore the vast majority believe Y, or it is simply not supported by the facts. But I do want to note that we have to understand, as the example of in Iraq showed, that you couldn't simply come in and write a constitution and have parliamentary democracy in a country that didn't have shared bonds of citizenship and didn't see each other as partners in a common endeavor. Yeah. And with respect to Jason's point earlier, you did have people in Latin America who rose up against injustice. They're the people who freed their countries between 1810 and 1821.
Well, they did, and actually,
and they ran into the problem that you couldn't simply import the American Constitution and graft it onto a people who weren't Americans.
Yeah. Okay, Jason, any further comment?
No, this has been great.
So, right. Good. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Good chatting with you guys.
Okay.
Thank you. Good to see you, Henry.
See you. Bye.